Windhorse is our innate ability to uplift ourselves and our environment by giving rise to a positive energy that is both relaxed and disciplined. Since 1981, Windhorse Community Services has integrated this understanding with modern conventional therapies, meditation, and contemplative traditions in the development of at-home, whole-person mental health recovery. Windhorse Journal is dedicated to the mission of communicating decades of clinical and personal experience to professionals, educators, students, and anyone seeking recovery options. Please join the dialogue.
Welcome to Windhorse Journal Entry 75. Could I be a voice for those still suffering? This is the first of a 4-part series that offers a recount of one team's experience on the path towards recovery. Nearly 10 years after her treatment ended, Julia joins her Windhorse team members, Janalee Chapin, Jack Gipple, and Chuck Knapp, to discuss her 12 years of working with Windhorse and Dr. Green. Please note that some content may be challenging to hear. May it be of benefit for those still suffering and their loved ones.
Welcome everyone to the Windhorse Journal. I'm your host, Chuck Knapp, and I'm so pleased and honored to be presenting today's podcast, which is a first for us, a conversation with a former team about the completely remarkable recovery journey they shared. We're joined today by our dear friend and former client, Julia, and by Janalee Chapin and Jack Gipple, who were her primary team members. To begin, Janalee and Jack, would you please introduce yourselves a bit more fully?
Sure. My name is Janalee Chapin, and I started the Windhorse work back in the 1980s. It was called Maitri Psychological Services then. And then at some point, my husband and I moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, and helped to begin Windhorse Associates there. And then we moved back to Boulder and helped Chuck Knapp with Windhorse Community Services. And I'm also a core professor at Naropa University.
And I'm Jack Gipple, and actually Janalee and Chuck were my introduction to Windhorse, as was Julia. And I came here after working for a decade out of grad school at the local homeless shelter, and among other things. This was my first team with Windhorse, actually, and Janalee and Chuck were my kind of first instructors into the art of basic attendance and being on a team. And Julia was actually probably my first instructor in the art. I've stayed with Windhorse for the last 20 plus years, and I'm now the clinical services manager of Windhorse Community Services.
Thank you, Jack. Julia, would you please say something about what you're currently doing in life, and your family, and something about your profession?
Yeah, sure. I have been an ESL teacher for a long time. I actually retired in 2017, and retirement was quite difficult for me. I was kind of floundering around and didn't know what to do with myself. All of a sudden, I wasn't working, and that was a big change for me. I started to do some traveling with my family. I went to Nepal, and I spent some time in England, and I did a lot of visiting of my children all over the country, and spent a lot of time with my 7 grandchildren, which was amazing. Then, of course, when COVID hit, life really changed for me, as it did for everyone. And now things have been much slower. I've been spending a lot of time at home and walking a lot, spending a lot of time reading and watching movies. Things have been really quiet. I've been trying to do some more writing as well.
I think it's worth noting here that you wrote a wonderful book. It's available through Amazon Kindle at this point. And when did you publish that?
That was published in 2014.
Thank you, Julia. Before getting into our first question, I want to offer a bit of perspective. I've now had a long career working almost entirely with people in extreme states. I've known Janely, you nearly that whole time. We actually met in graduate school. You were a little ahead of me, and we've been colleagues and friends since. Julia and Jack, I've met you a bit over 20 years ago, and I think, Jack, I met you actually just before we started your team, Julia. What we're going to be discussing today is one of the most remarkable and intelligent recovery processes I've been fortunate enough to be part of. This began, Julia, at a really dangerous point in your life. And as I mentioned, you wrote a wonderful book about the process. But as a group, even though you all immediately formed a powerful convergence of personalities, skills, tenacity, a lot of tenacity, and urges toward health, I know that we would have been completely amazed when we first created this team in 1999 that we'd be gathered here today for this conversation. Thank you all for being here. So, Julia, you had a very full life prior to us knowing you as a client. And within that, you had experiences that eventually gave rise to some of your later extreme states. And would you please describe your life prior to knowing us and meeting us and help us understand the ways in which your environment and early life kind of set up the events that were so difficult later on?
Yes, I had a difficult childhood. I was the youngest of three girls, and I had a very close relationship with my oldest sister, who was 13 years older than I was. In a lot of ways, my oldest sister became a surrogate mother to me. My relationship with my mother was distant and strained. I was very close with my father. However, my parents were divorced when I was about 8 years old. And I really wanted to go and live with him after the divorce. But at that time, children did not live with their fathers after a divorce, especially little girls. I don't know what would have happened with little boys, but it was never even presented to me as an option. When I was 10, my oldest sister got married. So that was an additional problem for me. I was very close with her. And I continued to have a very close relationship with her. But I really missed her a lot. When I was 12, I was sexually abused by a very close, trusted adult in my life. And that went on for about 3 or 3.5 years. And I never told anybody about that. I actually had a best friend in my life, someone I had met when I was 7, and she lived in the same building that I lived in. We were very good friends from the time we were 7, and actually we're still best friends now. And I never told her about it, which was really interesting because I told her everything. And I remember feeling incredibly guilty and ashamed, and I felt very much to blame, that in a lot of ways I was responsible for what had happened. And I felt really bad, like I was a really bad person. And I kind of buried it and tried not to think about it. And it disappeared into me when I was about 16. This ended shortly before I was 16. I was in high school. And at that point, I met the person who would go on to become my husband. And I remember having a lot of wild times in high school, being a kind of wild person, doing a lot of crazy things. And then going on to nursing school. I found nursing school to be challenging. It was harder for me academically than high school. And I was very obsessive, and nursing school brought out a lot of obsessions I was afraid to make mistakes. I also remember going through a psychiatric rotation where I was placed in a hospital with young women who I felt had less severe issues than I did. They had a lot of problems. A lot of them had issues that I identified with. And I remember starting to really identify with them and feeling like I was kind of one of them. And it was hard for me to be a nurse at that time. And I decided to go into therapy, which I did. I also failed a class. I was not able to study, and I graduated a semester late. After graduation, I got married and started to work in a hospital as an obstetrical nurse. I was having a training program, and I was watching the first delivery that I had ever seen. And it was a very interesting experience to watch for the first time. And I decided that, somebody had made a mistake after the baby was born, and they hadn't been paying attention to something that, of course, I was paying attention to. And I kind of froze, and I felt like I should have said something that I saw. I thought the baby wasn't breathing, and I thought nobody else had noticed, and that I should have said something about it. And, nothing really happened. The baby was fine, except that I wasn't fine, and I was obsessing and looping obsessions about this for a very long time, that I hadn't reacted, I hadn't done anything that I should have. And was the baby fine? Did the baby have brain damage because of something I hadn't done? And I actually just left the job, barely after I started. And that stayed with me for years and years. I wasn't able to stop obsessing about that for years and years and years. After a while, my husband at the time and I joined the Peace Corps. We were the first people in our families to ever leave New York. So it was a really big deal. And this was very much against the will of our families. We thought it was crazy to do anything like that. And it was a continuation of our wild, impulsive behavior. But it was great. It was very exciting until I was the only nurse in the program where we were sent. And during our training period, we were in the middle of really nowhere, living in a hut. And somebody knocked on our door in the middle of the night with a little baby who was probably a month old, who's very, very dehydrated and really appeared dead. And they wanted me to do something about it. And I didn't have any idea of what to do. I was not trained as a doctor, and I was barely capable of being a nurse, certainly not capable of doing anything in that situation. And there was a health aide that was caring for that community, but they did not want the health aide to make decisions. And the health aide actually wanted to defer to me. They felt that I was a white American person and who would know better how to care for this child than he did. And of course, that was not true at all. Eventually, this baby had to be rushed to a hospital, which was quite far away. And we were on an island, and baby had to be taken by a motorboat in a storm, with me holding an IV. It was really quite a nightmare. And there was a doctor there who took care of this child for about 2 weeks, and I went with the child and slept under a crib in the hospital for 2 weeks with the baby, and felt incredibly responsible. The baby was fine. The baby was dehydrated and was treated, and the baby was fine. And again, linked me back to the obsession about the baby. After, when I had worked in the obstetrical ward, and it just added another obsession. And I almost left the Peace Corps at that time. And those two obsessions stayed with me for years and years and years, and just destroyed me. I could not stop obsessing about those things, and they became out of control, and they looped off into things that had really nothing to do with what had actually happened. And it was hard for me to remember what had actually happened. They just were crazy. After the Peace Corps, we did a lot of traveling and eventually came back to the States. Things quieted down for a while, but I wasn't able to work. I had a lot of depression and actually ended up being in the hospital for a while because I became pretty suicidal. After being discharged from the hospital, we decided to have a baby, and our first child was born. And after that, I was on an incredible high for 2 years. I was loving being a mother. It was a wonderful experience. I loved being a mother. I don't know whether it was an adrenaline rush or what it was, but it was an incredible experience. And I was very happy for the first 2 years. And then I had a crash. I became very, very, very depressed, very obsessive, and totally unable to take care of my 2-year-old son. And went into therapy with a psychiatrist who, I don't know how I found him. I don't remember where he came from, but he molested me. And I had seen him a few times, and he had some issues apparently, and started telling me he loved me, and that I shouldn't be so depressed, and what a wonderful person I was, and then started molesting me. And then I remember running out of his office and became very suicidal. And my ex-husband at the time found a psychiatrist who put me in the hospital. And at that point, I remembered what had happened when I was a child with the person who had sexually abused me. And I had forgotten that for so many years. I didn't tell anyone about what this psychiatrist had done. I didn't want to get him in trouble. And it was pretty much the same thing. I never told anyone about that, what that person had done to me as a child. I protected both of them. And don't remember exactly what happened. Years later, I had a lot of shock treatments, and my memory's been very spotty about a lot of things that happened in the past. But a lot of my memory never came back after the ECT, so I can't remember a lot of things very clearly. But after that time period, things did settle down for a while, and we had 2 more children. And after that, we decided to move to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was an amazing time period in my life. I loved being in Hong Kong. It was a culture that I really loved. I studied Cantonese. I loved learning another language. I loved the people. I loved the food. My kids were learning Cantonese. I made friends there. I went back to school and got a degree in teaching English as a second language, which was a far easier career for me to have. I didn't have to worry about killing people or hurting people. And all in all, it was a great time. At the end of 6 years, Hong Kong was going back to Chinese rule. And so we had to come back to the States. I think that if we could have, we probably would have stayed there because we really loved living there, but it wasn't an option. And then we came back to Denver at that time, and we were living in Boulder. I got a job teaching English as a second language in Denver and was commuting every day from Boulder to Denver. It was a long drive, and I was also taking classes to complete my master's degree and had 3 children, and it was very, very stressful. I had a lot of responsibility, and it was too hard for me. I had taken on too much, and the obsessions came back in full swing. I was obsessing more than I ever had. I was calling places like McDonald's and telling them that their food was spoiled, that their freezers weren't cold enough. I was going to restaurants and telling them that there was bones in the fish that they were serving and that people were going to choke and die. And I remember humiliating my family, and it was affecting my family life, and it was getting out of control. At that point, I found or heard of a book. It was called The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing. And it was about a young boy who was obsessively washing his hands and had found the drug anafranil. And as I recall, it had helped him. And so I decided to get this drug anafranil. And so I went online and found a psychiatrist, called him up, and made an appointment and explained that I was having all of these obsessions and that I needed to take anafranil. And he gave me anafranil along with another medication. I don't remember what it was. However, it appeared that I was latently bipolar, and he didn't know that. I didn't know that. And these drugs set off this wildly manic phase in my life. And I started doing very crazy things like driving to work on I-25 with my eyes closed for longer and longer periods of time, like playing this Russian roulette game with myself, and other things that were equally dangerous. And one day I just woke up in the hospital in 5-point restraints, and I never really knew what happened. Apparently, someone called the police. When I woke up, I worried about whether I had killed someone, whether I had had a terrible accident, and I hadn't, but apparently I drove off the road or I did something, and the police came, and I was in the hospital then probably for 3 months, and that's when I had 22 ECT treatments.
Julia, that was a really well described arc of your life. So all through that period, you were describing, well, early on, you were describing how, in retrospect, you were having difficulties with various kinds of adjustments related to the sexual trauma. And then at some point, the obsession started. Do you see that now as probably being related to the sexual trauma as well?
I had obsessions as a child. I used to, not walk on cracks and count toilet paper. I think that was probably before the sexual abuse happened. I had a lot of obsessive issues when I was little.
Yeah.
Also,
Okay.
I had a difficult relationship with my mother. She was very critical of me. I always felt very rejected. I never measured up to anything that she wanted. I was too heavy. My grades weren't good enough in school, and which of course my sister was very thin and had super grades and skipped a level, and she had everything that I didn't have. And I think the hardest part for me was that my mother didn't say, you have to study more or you have to, work harder. She just It was what she expected from me.
Mhm.
And that was probably the hardest thing, was that she didn't expect any more from me.
So all these things were combining, and at some point, the anapranil kicked your bipolar cycling into gear in a very energetic way.
Yeah. Things just became crazy. I have no memory of that
Yeah.
happening. I know what I was told. Things were very, very bad.
One thing I'm aware of, hearing it now, it's been some years since we stopped the team and working together. And I think I've heard almost everything, but you're putting it together in much more coherent, like clearly you've made more sense of it than when you and I last spoke. So
Mhm.
And I think the only thing I'm struck with as I'm listening is how the systemic abuse kind of went all the way through this
Mhm.
situation of Julia's life. That just strikes me now.
Yeah. Yeah. And that will continue to show itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're still not quite to the point where we met you, Julia. And somewhere in the hospital, as I understand it, another serious development in terms of difficulty for you began, the cutting.
Yes,
Yeah.
that happened in the hospital.
Could you please say something about how that came about?
Yes. The hospital that I was in was a locked psychiatric hospital. At that time, it was a long time ago. And I guess situations in psychiatric hospitals were different. Conditions were different. Even though it was a locked hospital, they had lamps in rooms. And I had a lamp in my room with a light bulb in it. And that was when I first cut myself. And I was in a tremendous amount of pain. I was obsessing like crazy. I saw blood stains on the floor, and I was sure that, the blood stains had AIDS, and I had to report everything to everyone. And I was listening to people's conversations on the phone, and I felt responsible that they were going to do something. And I mean, the obsessions were just really, really more than I could deal with. And when I saw the light bulb in my room, I had this idea about cutting myself. And so I took the light bulb out of the lamp and I wrapped it in a towel and smashed it on the floor. I wrapped it so that nobody would hear it breaking. And I was very careful to make sure that nobody heard the light bulb break. And and of course nobody did. And I cut myself up, cut my arms up like crazy. And that was the beginning of my cutting career in the hospital. And the fact that they had light bulbs in rooms in psychiatric hospitals just still amazed me, that nobody actually thought about that. Just was shocking to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Um, but I continued to cut myself. I don't remember when they took the light bulbs out. Then my ex-husband decided, he was very good friends with my psychiatrist. He really liked him. And he felt that if they had met under different circumstances, they could have been really good friends. They were both, very similar age and the same religious background, and that, they just really hit it off. Anyway, my ex-husband told the psychiatrist who was treating me about what had happened with sexual abuse. And I had not told him about it, but my ex husband told him about it. And I think at that time, maybe that was something that women claimed, that they had been sexually abused, or maybe psychiatrists didn't believe that, or I don't know. But he wanted me to call from his office to ask him about it on the phone and see if he would confirm that in fact he had done that to me. And I had to call him. I mean, I guess I could have said no, but I didn't feel like I was in a position to say that. And I called him, and I was totally re-traumatized. That was one of the most traumatic experiences for me, to call him and have him talk to me about it and confirm it and ask me questions about what he had done. And I mean, it was horrifying. It was just absolutely horrifying that I had to do that. And to this day, I don't know um, why he did that. But it was a terribly traumatic experience, and didn't help the cutting. I just continued cutting and cutting and cutting for years. And I started cutting all over my breasts, which is where he really would touch me all the time until he decided to go farther. But, my breasts are like ribbons, from being cut up, because that's where he liked to touch me. And it was the fact that I had to call him. I've talked with different psychiatrists that I was seeing over the years, and it seems like at that time, that was something they thought women were claiming they remembered, but maybe wasn't necessarily true. I don't know. And so I ran away from the hospital. I ran away from the hospital many times.
I'm sitting with the level of pain I'm hearing, and somehow we're finding your way to stay alive through this. Just to be clear here, the cutting, as I understand it, what you were doing wasn't about killing yourself. It was about something else.
Over the years, going forward after that, most of the time, I'd say 90% of the time, the cutting was not about attempting suicide.
Mhm.
It was about incredible pain. And I think maybe I talked to Jack about it over the years, and generally, the pain had built up, and the cutting was a way of letting that pain out. And I felt so much better after. I never felt any pain from cutting. It was never painful, although now when I think about it, I get the chills. I can't even think about how painful that would have been, but I never felt any pain. But it's just like, a balloon ready to burst, and you pop it, and it just takes all of the air out of it, all of the pain out of it. And I
Yeah,
would just feel so much better. But I wasn't trying to kill myself.
yeah, yeah. The paper the book and the paper that you wrote, I highly encourage people to really read that. It's not easy reading, but you're an excellent writer, and so it's quite vivid. And you explain that dynamic very well. I'm going to come back to something. So systemic. Generally, you talked about systemic abuse, abuse from people in your childhood that were supposed to be adults. And then this started replaying itself again in hospital systems
Mhm.
where you certainly weren't getting what you needed, and some of what you were being asked to do or made to do was re-traumatizing. So at some point you were talking about leaving the hospital, and you found a person, a psychiatrist, that he played such a significant role for you in your path of recovery, and that was Dr. Green. How did you and Dr. Green happen to meet each other and form a relationship?
I was in the hospital for a very long time, and when they finally agreed to discharge me, one of the conditions was that I had to have a therapist that I would be seeing regularly on an outpatient basis. And they gave me a list of, I think, 4 different therapists. And a couple of them were people I had seen at the hospital there, not as my therapist, but, I had seen them, as alternate people, or, they knew me. And I think 1 or 2 of them that knew me refused to see me. They just said they would not take me on as a patient. And it was, in a way, kind of funny, but it was crushing to me that, you apply to a university and you get rejected, but who gets rejected by a psychiatrist for being too sick? It was like, wow, that's crushing
Yeah.
for a psychiatrist to reject you as a patient. I mean, I was devastated by that. Then another one, the third one on the list, agreed to see me. And he said, I really love difficult cases. And he said that to me. And I told him to go fuck himself. I mean, what a mean thing to say to somebody. That was just it was so mean. It made me feel so terrible. It was just lacking in any kind of compassion. That ended him. And Dr. Green was the last person on the list. And I made an appointment to see him while I was still at the hospital. And he was this incredibly gentle person. I don't know how to describe him. He was gentle, he was kind, he didn't push me, he didn't say anything that was scary to me. He made me feel really safe. I asked him if he thought he could help me. And because at that point, I didn't feel anyone could help me. Everyone made it pretty clear that they didn't feel like I was helpable. And he said yes, he really felt like he could. And I believed him.
Mhm.
I didn't think he was just saying that. He seemed, like he was saying it from his heart. And that's how I met him, and that's how I started to see him.
Yeah, yeah. Well, your instincts were certainly excellent to tell that one person to go fuck themselves and to
It was such a mean thing to say to me. I already had the worst possible feelings about myself, and I didn't need
yeah,
him to say that
yeah,
to me.
yeah. And in the midst of all that kind of intensity and confusion that you were going through, you recognized something in Dr. Green, that somehow there was some kind of connection and recognition that he was a person you could possibly trust, explore trusting. Yeah.
He wasn't trying to impress me. He wasn't trying to do anything, to prove himself in any way. He was just kind and open, and that's how he remained for 25 years or more. You know.
So how long did you work with him before meeting Chanley and Jack?
Probably not that long, because I went home from the hospital and I couldn't survive
Mhm.
at home. I was cutting myself. I was always getting back into the hospital. Sometimes the cutting was bad enough that it might have been suicidal. I was cutting arteries. I was cutting almost organs inside. They were having to x-ray to see that I hadn't cut organs. And I was also overdosing all the time.
Mhm.
On top of cutting, I was overdosing all the time. They had to put tubes down me and charcoal. And so it was cutting and overdosing,
Yeah. Yeah.
both.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time back in the hospital. I couldn't be alone.
Yeah. Right.
So my sister did a lot of research and found out about Windhorse.
Mhm.
So it wasn't long after I got out of the hospital.
Right. So you and I first met. I was doing admissions in those days and also doing clinical work. And you and I first met, and I was definitely impressed with how difficult your situation was, how you couldn't be by yourself. At the same time, hospitals were no place to spend much time, really. I mean, safety, yes, for sure. But as far as living a life there and trying to find some sense of connection to ordinary healthy living, it is, it's they're not an easy place to be. And so I was very impressed with your kind of brightness and ferocity, and it sounds funny to say this, but elegance. You had a definite quality of that. I met you at your home, and I really enjoyed talking with you. And so we were talking this morning about how you met Janalee and Jack, and I'm curious what your impressions were of them when you first met them.
Um, right off the bat, before I met them, they negative. I had very little positive feelings about women. I didn't have positive feelings about my mother. We had a very bad relationship, and so when you said that you were bringing over Jenna Lee, I think the first thing I said to you was a woman, or oh no, or I don't know what I said. I know that that's what I felt, and so I wasn't happy about that. And then Jenna Lee came in and you introduced us, and then you left, and I was alone with Jenna Lee, and I think it took, I don't know, 5 minutes before I was pouring out my heart to Jenna Lee.
Mhm.
I fell in love with Jenna Lee. Jenna Lee was amazing, and I just loved her
Yeah.
right off the bat. Still do.
So your instincts were still able to see things. You were still able to see a spark of something when it was with you.
She was so non-critical. The women in my life, my mother, it was so critical of me, and I was so critical of me. I was taking a lot of medication.
Mhm.
I was, I'm 5 feet tall. I weighed 205 pounds at that time. I was as wide as I was tall, and it killed me. It was killing me to be that overweight, and I had no ability to have any affect. You know what I mean? My face was just like I don't know, you know,
Mhm.
I couldn't show any affect. I was like frozen,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I hated myself,
Yeah.
and I was so critical. But Janalee was not critical at all. I didn't feel like she was looking at me and seeing all the terrible things that I saw.
Yeah. Yeah. You felt that. You knew that was medicine in a certain way. Not trying to reduce your relationship to something that seems that simplistic, but at the same time, people in our relationships are very medicine like sometimes, and the qualities of them. How about Jack? What was it like to meet Jack?
Jack was very different. Jack is definitely not Janalee. Very different. I saw Jack walk in with his ponytail, and I knew you said he came from Minnesota, and I said, "Ah, this guy is a hippie from the Midwest, and we are not going to get along at all."
Mhm.
And I think it didn't take 10 minutes before I adored Jack. He was smart and sharp and had this great sense of humor, and I just loved them both They were so different. They still are. And I needed both of them. Jack always joked that no matter how many times we would fight or I wouldn't talk to him for months, I never once canceled one meeting with him because I the thought of him not coming would overwhelm me with anxiety. Even if I didn't talk to him or yelled at him or whatever, I needed him to be there. I think that something that was really important to me was when you first came over, Chuck, and then Jack and Jenny, something that was so hard for me was I felt so terrible. I felt so incredibly overweight and so plastic, that I couldn't really speak well and that I looked kind of affectless because of all of the medication. And I didn't want you to see me that way. It was so important for me that you not see me that way because that wasn't me. And I wanted you to know that that really wasn't me. And I wanted you to see my house to show you that I had a life that was before all of that craziness, that I had traveled and I had lived overseas and I had things, from other experiences. And it was just so important to me that you could see me in a different way and not just see me as this big fat lady that couldn't speak or walk, and just in terms of working with people, that Windhorse talks about that a lot, that there's a life before. um, and it was so important for me to try to tell you that, even though I couldn't tell you in any way, in any words. And I was trying to show you that. And it was something that was going on inside of me, inside my mind. I wanted to make you tea. I wanted to just show you that this was not who I was, that there was more to me. And I remember that so well that was something that I thought about so much.
And you were such a great storyteller. I remember asking you about the things in your house, and I'd say, now tell me, where did this come from? And then you would tell me this whole story about whatever it was. And it was fascinating just to, I mean, you remember that you didn't speak much, but I remember that you had all these stories to tell.
I'm curious, Janely and Jack, how it was for you to meet Barbara. What were your impressions and experience?
My memory was it had to have been May that we met, because I distinctly remember it was late afternoon. Chuck introduced us and left. I remember you sitting in one of your chairs in the living room. You made me tea, as I recall. And I remember there was those early spring thunderstorms that just kind of roll through Boulder. And that kind of, I remember the mood of that was quite striking. And I think that was, the rains were kind of coming and going. The trees were leafing out. So it was that kind of early spring. I just remember that really distinctly. I had no idea who you were. And I had actually been told that a number of people had met you and not passed muster, so I shouldn't take it personally if you didn't like me. And this is Chuck who had prepared me. I had no idea if you liked me or not. It's funny because it's hard for me to separate who you are now from who you were then, frankly. And I forgot that you were quite big. You had put on a lot of weight. I never remember that now, but that was true. At some point, I did pass muster. There was no indication. I remember you seemed just super guarded and just furious. That was my impression of you. And I think, once we started to meet, we met twice a week for 3 hours at a time. I remember it was probably a couple, 3 months, 3 months before I started to feel like I knew, like I started to go, oh, that's who you are. Like it took a while. You were so cocooned in just rage and hurt and medication. As I recall, you were on Depakote, I think. It was terrible. And I remember early on walking down the sidewalk with you, and you would kind of careen off into the grass because you were so snookered on these heavy medications that you were really impaired by it. I remember that was just kind of heartbreaking. And we used to it was hard to do that kind of thing, to walk around with you initially. I remember the one thing that could work is we'd go for drives, and I would drive different places. I remember driving to or almost to Estes Park and then just turn around and drive back. That's when I remember, like, the rhythm of our conversation would be very slow. You'd say something, and then I figured out pretty quickly I shouldn't respond right away. And I started to leave about as much time responding to you as you took to respond when I made a comment. And they wouldn't be very deep comments. You weren't pouring your heart out to me like you were to Jana Lee. It was much more guarded and simple conversations, but it seemed very important. But it was a very long conversation back and forth. Like I later said it was like playing tennis on the moon. And it was this long volley of conversation. Yeah, that's what was called for, like really slow, a lot of space. I remember leaving shifts and just feeling my own somatic experience was just numb, like kind of thick and numb and just kind of a buzzing. I can remember right now, I can kind of remember how that felt, that kind of thick somatic quality in my own body. Usually I would call Jana Lee. I think we had it set up because I mean I was a trainee, I'd never done this basic attendance thing before. And so Jana Lee in particular was helping me understand it as we went. So she would help me kind of debrief my time with you. So that's my memory of early days with you.
I'm remembering early on when I first met you, walking into your home and feeling like I was walking into this very beautiful, elegant place where everything had its own place, and I could feel the precision of your mind right away. And you you were so attracted to very beautiful things. You had these beautiful lamps and beautiful figurines from China, maybe, or Japan, and just your house was so tasteful. And you had these two dogs, Chloe and Shannon, who were your companions and who were so important to you. And I do remember in the beginning, you didn't you didn't like Jack that much. You were saying, "Who is this guy?" And I don't know if I can relate to him. And this hippie with his long hair, So it took a while. And you said to me the first time, I remember you said, "I guess I should make you a cup of tea, shouldn't I?" And I said, "Well, it's okay. It doesn't matter." But you said, "Well, I don't really like women all that much, so I don't know how this is going to go." And I was wondering that myself. But then I remember that I took you to my house and you met my son, who was very young at the time. I think he was 3, or no, he was 4 or 4.5. And one thing that I learned so early on with you is if I said anything about a case, or if I wasn't authentic, if I wasn't heartfelt and just kind of being who I was with you, you were very upset by that. I think I remember one time Jack said something about my shift with Julia, and you were so upset by using that word, that somehow that was a clinical word or something that made it that somehow there was some kind of power that didn't feel right to you. So I remember at some point Jack didn't use that word anymore.
It just seemed like a job that made it just seem like, my shift at the metal factory. It just made it seem so cold and not caring, and like I was just some kind of car that he was working on at the factory, not that he was working or cared about me at all. It made me feel terrible.
Well, what you tuned me up to with your reaction to that, and other ones that I also made the mistake of doing, is something that Ed Podville, who is kind of the founder of this Windhorse approach, was this asylum mentality where we as therapists can kind of get into this frame of using language in a way to separate ourselves from our clients or from our friends. And so your reaction to that really reminded me to pay more attention to my language and my just how I related to you. And I remember we did have lots of very deep conversations after we got to know each other. It took a while, but we talked a lot about how you were feeling or that you weren't feeling. And I remember at one point asking you, don't you feel angry about this, whatever we were talking about? And that was sort of a new emotion to explore for you at that time. Anger. Yeah. Somehow it wasn't allowed, or that wasn't okay to feel angry. And that seemed like a really important part of your healing to kind of come in contact with that. I also remember returning a lot of things at stores, Macy's, for instance. You would have these sprees where you would buy a lot of things, and sometimes 5 or 6 or 8 of the same thing, and then we would end up returning them together, going to Macy's and returning them. And for a while, sometimes I would feel that sometimes the clerk would give you a hard time. Why did you buy so many, and why are you returning all of these, and couldn't you think about that beforehand? I mean, she was really kind of reaming you, and you were just so adamant, I don't want these, I am returning them, and you have a policy that I can do that. So I remember that as some of our times that we spent together.
Do you remember all of the crystal necklaces I bought? And
Yeah,
I still have 5 of those,
you do.
which
Wow.
they wouldn't take back. And the
Uh-huh.
flowers, the glass flowers, I think I bought with
Yes.
you, Jack. I
Yeah.
still have 5 of those as well. How many years later?
Yeah.
I remember this too, and you would buy a bunch of them, and then you'd return them, and you have to choose which ones to return, which ones to keep, and then you'd go back and buy them again,
Mm.
and then return them, and like that went on and on. So just in defense of the clerk, it probably wasn't the first time. Like
Right.
you do cycles of this, and the clerks were like, "What are you doing? You're buying
Right.
these and returning them," and I can see them wrapping them up in tissue paper, you
Mm.
know.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yes. And even though I might have acted angry towards them, I was so ashamed and so in pain inside that they would have no idea. My outward behavior might have been to act angry at them, but I was burning up with embarrassment and shame inside. That might have just been a reaction to kind of help me deal with how I felt. I remember those things like they were yesterday.
Mm.
It was hard.
When we were talking about the glass tulips, I was remembering. So at this time, I'm married, have 2 kids, and I had 2 young daughters, and my youngest um, was 6 months old, not even, when you and I started to work together. And and I didn't live that far from you, maybe a quarter of a mile away. And it would have been later because I remember it was snowy out. So if we started in May, it was like, it was the next winter sometime. I remember we would, we often would go out to restaurants and eat lunch. And there was some negotiating over checks or things. And I remember I needed to give you money, and I wrote you a personal check to cover whatever I owed you. And then I remember thinking like, I was getting to know you, but also you were angry, and by now there was a kind of a sense of, I don't think you liked my wife very much. I think you liked my kids a lot, but there was a sense of competition or something. And I found that it was better if I didn't talk much about my wife. I remember feeling just protective in general. And I remember saying, so I'm going to give this check, but it's got my address on it. So I don't want you to write that down and keep it. Oh no, I would never do that. Of course not, Jack. And and of course you did. and within like a week, there was snow on the ground, I remember. And
Christmas.
yeah, it was probably Christmas, exactly. And you gave, suddenly there's two or three of these glass roses on my porch with a very elegant, gift to them. But I remember feeling like you were counting coup on me. It's like, oh, you don't want me to violate your boundaries? Here's a gift. Oh, it was a gift. It was a gift. And I remember that was probably I don't know, there may have been prior fights, but that was definitely a point of, that was angry. And I called you out on it. And I said, that's not okay. You said you wouldn't do that and you did it. And I don't appreciate that. And I don't remember exactly, but you were really, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? Like, oh, boundaries. And so, and it must have been a Christmas holiday because for some reason, Jan Lee wasn't around. Dr. Arkansas was covering for Dr. Green, and he called us in his office. I remember he always wore a leather jacket and had a motorcycle. And he called us in the office. He was going to do a nice, really little like couples thing between you and me. And he tried to mend our relationship, but it took a while. It took a while to work through that one. And we would go back and recycle that. And I never really agreed with you, and you never really agreed with me, and I'm not sure you still do, but but anyway, I do remember
And I
that.
did the same thing with Dr. Green years
Yeah.
later. It was a Christmas gift, and I put it outside your door and never rang the bell or never did anything. And you were furious. And I really didn't understand. I didn't ring your doorbell or in any way violate your privacy. I had forgotten about the check that you had asked me not to. I forgot about that. I just wanted to give you a Christmas present, and I meant no harm. And I remember the big fight that we had, and that we went to Dr. Arkansas to,
Yeah.
and I did do something that you had asked me not to do, and I did the same thing with Dr. Green years later when I went to see his fiance.
Right.
Right, to check her out.
Yeah, Julia, that's such a rich story. Let's hold that for a little bit later.
Yeah.
But one of the comments that listening to this whole early section, including this story, Jack, that you and Julia were just talking about, is how you, Julia, refused to be treated in a way that didn't honor you as a full human being. That's my impression as what I remember and as what we're talking about this. Even if it went against what somebody else wanted, you were, I think, pretty fierce in declaring that you weren't going to be settling for kind of half human status. Does that make sense?
I think I always felt so unimportant in my life that people never really valued me. And when I started to see Dr. Green, he started to we started to develop this relationship where he made me feel like he really cared about me. I used to bring food to his office, and he would eat it, all the time. And when he went on vacation, he would tell me he was going to visit his sister in California, and this was long before he got married again. And I was devastated because I could never see another therapist. I just couldn't. And I remember he gave me his sister's phone number once, because I was going to fall apart. And I never called her, but just the fact that he gave it to me just meant everything to me. I just felt like he really valued me and cared about me, and um, and that was what happened with Jack. I just wanted to feel like that I wasn't a shift, that
Yeah.
he cared about me as a person. Um, that's all it was. I wasn't trying to, and I never had bad feelings about your wife. I don't know that I ever even met her, but I don't remember feeling anything like that. But I don't remember a lot of things.
I distinctly remember.
Could be. I mean, I don't
You
remember that.
time saved. It was just that thought of her, and I always thought it was kind of.
But I met her.
I don't know that you'd even met her at this point, but my memory is you didn't like the idea of it. I think it was this idea that I had other relationships outside of ours that was hard to, think of.
That that could
I
be.
think, it's weird to look back because I mean, it's decades later and I'm a different person. You're a different person. At the
Yeah,
time, I had just worked for 10 years with homeless people in a pretty rough situations, and I felt very protective of my young family and
sure.
very concerned. And I think I was still my instincts were still calibrated to working with a pretty rough population. So, that's
Sure.
very much a kind of whatever therapist-y clinical perspective. But you know, I I remember just, we're both in our process, right? I'm in, we often in Windhorse talk about mutual recovery. Like I was working with my boundaries and trying to figure out what this was
Yeah,
too, you know. And you and I went through a lot of that together, and I really appreciate it. You and I also, I think, often I think I'll say you feel this way, but I think I learned this too. Is like you were a safe person to have like really intense conflict with. You and I had some really champion,
we
you know,
did.
episodes of conflict. One of them that lasted, I think, 2 months is my memory. Um, but
Yeah.
at the time, it wasn't anything great. But I would say I learned a lot, and you were somebody I learned was safe in conflict. Like we could do it, and by safe, I don't just mean in the moment. Like you kept showing up. Like you get pissed at me. Like you would get white hot with me. I could get really mad with you, and we stayed in relationship, that's unique. Usually, when you work with people in in life, people don't stay in relationship very well and be really furious. You were kind of good at that. You could, we could.
That happened with me because I needed to know that you wouldn't leave, that I could trust
Yeah,
that whatever I did,
yeah,
that I could trust that you wouldn't leave. And
yeah,
that was really important to me. Not that I wouldn't leave you, because that would have never even been a thought, but that you wouldn't say, I can't deal with you anymore. That you wouldn't do that. I mean, I did all of that kind of testing to see how much I could push him away, and all the things I could do that would be so negative. I had his home phone number that I'm sure he changed after a while, but I would call him all night, and the things that I did to see if he would leave, to see if he would leave me. And I'm sure I did the same thing with you.
yeah,
It wasn't a matter of me leaving. That was never a possibility or a thought. It was testing to see if you would leave.
yeah. There's lots of, I mean, for lack of a better word, of boundary testing. And I remember you told me that with Dr. Green, you had an agreement with him. You could call all night and leave messages, and he would listen to them all, and he would call you if there was something to be worried about, because you'd call and I think share worries about, things that were just
That's
tormenting you. And you said, as I recall, you said he never called you back, but you trusted that he listened, and if it was something serious, he would call you.
right. I had an arrangement with Dr. Green because I had all of these terrible obsessions about freezers not being cold enough in the supermarket and babies, being left outside of stores, and I don't know, all of these things, fish and food and supermarkets, and just I don't even remember all of these things that I worried about. And I would call him and tell him, leave him messages about all of these things. And the arrangement was that if he thought there was something I needed to do about it, some way I needed to act on it, if it was a realistic worry, that he would call me back and tell me that I needed to do something. And he never, ever, ever called me back. And he listened to all of them because we talked about them, but all of my worries were not, things that needed to be acted on, that all of these obsessions. And I trusted him. It was like my passing this worry onto him. And I trusted him enough to know that if he said I didn't need to worry about it, then I was okay. And I didn't need to worry about it. He was like my conscience, or I don't know what to call it.
I think that these gifts that Julia was giving to Dr. Green, to Jack, to me, to my son, to your children, were really an important part of the healing process. Because so often in the clinical therapeutic world, those gifts are something that you should have a lot of conversation about, and often are, you should not have those gifts, so you should give them back if they're a certain amount, all those things. And again, kind of like what Chuck was saying, it seems so important for Julia to be able to be a human being who really had feelings for others and wanted to just express her generosity in ways that were appreciated. And so being able to accept the gift was also a part of a process for me that I went through, because sometimes I would feel, oh, I shouldn't take this. And yet it felt like some kind of amazing generosity for us to share together.
There's a theme running through this that we won't get into in this section of our conversation, but it's about history of sanity. And one of the, I think, very significant things that Ed Podville pointed to in terms of working with people was to be sure you understood their history of sanity, where they came from, where they felt like there was discipline and a sense of goodness and that they could offer that had meaning. And I think all of this conversation beautifully illustrates kind of the messiness and goodness of a team. Jack, you're going through your own process around the work you've been doing, how you understood the right kinds of boundaries. Julia, you were insisting on showing up in relationship as who you were and who you knew yourself to be, and making offerings to the world that you didn't want to be not seen. You wanted to be seen. And generally, I thought your description of how significant that was in the recovery process is just spot on. Thank you all. I really so appreciate being here with you today, and I look forward to picking this up again.
Thank you for listening to Windhorse Journal Entry 75. Stay tuned for next month's episode for a continuation of this conversation that dives even deeper into a profound process of healing and recovery. You can find the Windhorse Journal at windhorsecommunityservices.com/journal or on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Windhorse Journal is a publication of Windhorse Community Services, supporting recovery from mental health challenges at home and in the community since 1981.